The mining station's artificial gravity had been acting up again, which meant Jake Morrison's morning coffee was currently floating in perfectly spherical droplets somewhere near the ceiling of his quarters. He watched the brown orbs drift lazily through the recycled air, wondering if this was what philosophers meant when they talked about the absurdity of existence. Probably not, but philosophy had never been his strong suit anyway. Morrison to engineering, he said into his comm unit, still tracking the coffee constellation above his head. Please tell me you figured out why my breakfast is performing zero-G ballet. The response crackled back with the distinctive sound of someone trying very hard not to laugh. Sorry Lieutenant, we're still working on it. Seems like the gravity generators are having what Chief Kozlov calls creative differences with the main computer. Jake sighed and pushed off from his bunk, gliding toward the door with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent too many years in space. The corridor outside his quarters buzzed with the usual morning chaos of Kepler 442b mining station, though usual was a relative term when your workplace orbited a gas giant that occasionally rained diamonds and your coworkers included a geologist who spoke fluent Mandarin to the ore processors because she claimed it made them work better. The mess hall greeted him with the sight of 30 crew members trying to eat floating food with varying degrees of success. Petty Officer Chen had managed to catch a wayward biscuit in her mouth and was receiving a small round of applause, while Ensign Rodriguez was locked in what appeared to be mortal combat with a stubborn piece of reconstituted egg that kept bouncing off his spoon. Morning, sunshine, called out Chief Kozlov from his corner table, where he'd somehow managed to anchor his coffee cup to the surface with what looked suspiciously like industrial adhesive. Beautiful day for a gravity malfunction, don't you think? Jake maneuvered himself into a seat across from the chief, grabbing a meal tray that had been magnetically secured to the table. Please tell me this isn't going to be one of those days where everything goes wrong in alphabetical order. Well, we've already hit A for artificial gravity and B for breakfast difficulties, Kozlov said, taking a careful sip from his adhered cup. So I'd say we're making excellent progress. The comm system crackled to life with the voice of their communications officer, Ensign Park. All senior staff to the bridge, please. We've got, well, honestly sir, I'm not sure what we've got. Jake looked at Kozlov, who shrugged with the universal expression of space workers everywhere, another day, another inexplicable problem. They pushed off from their seats and glided toward the corridor, Jake grabbing a floating piece of toast on the way because even in the midst of cosmic uncertainty, a man had to eat. The bridge of Kepler 442b was a study in organized chaos, with displays showing mining yields, orbital mechanics, and what appeared to be a real-time feed of the station's coffee machine having an existential crisis. Ensign Park looked up from her station with the expression of someone who'd been staring at impossible data for too long. Sir, we're picking up some unusual readings on long-range sensors, she began, then paused as if trying to find the right words. It's like, have you ever seen a ghost on radar? Can't say that I have, Jake replied, settling into his command chair and strapping himself in. In zero gravity, dignity was often the first casualty. What kind of unusual are we talking about here? Park's fingers danced across her console, bringing up a three-dimensional display that showed their local space. There, she said, pointing to what looked like empty void. Sensor sweeps keep picking up something massive, maybe 20 kilometers out, but visual confirmation shows nothing. Jake studied the display, watching as the sensors painted and repainted the same area of space. There was definitely something there. The gravitational disturbance alone suggested a ship at least twice the size of their station, but whatever it was seemed to be playing hide-and-seek with the laws of physics. Could be a cloaking device, suggested Lieutenant Torres from the tactical station. Though I've never seen one this sophisticated. It's like they're not just hiding from our sensors, they're hiding from reality itself. Chief Kozlov floated over to the sensor station and began running diagnostics with the focused intensity of a man who'd spent 40 years making stubborn machinery behave. Sensors are working fine, he announced after a few minutes. Whatever's out there, it's real enough to bend space-time but polite enough not to show up for family photos. The coffee machine in the corner of the bridge chose that moment to emit a sound that could only be described as deeply offended, followed by a stream of what looked suspiciously like liquid silver instead of coffee. Everyone on the bridge turned to stare at it. Did anyone else's coffee machine just start dispensing what appears to be mercury? Jake asked, though he was fairly certain he knew the answer. Sir, Park said, her voice taking on the careful tone of someone delivering news that defied explanation, the coffee machine isn't the only thing acting strange. Our navigation AI has been responding to queries in what appears to be ancient Earth poetry, the waste recycling system is playing classical music, and the emergency lighting keeps flashing in patterns that our linguist thinks might be some form of mathematical equation. Jake felt that familiar sensation of the universe deciding to test his blood pressure. And you think this is connected to our invisible visitors? Well, sir, the timing seems a bit coincidental. Plus, the coffee machine just spelled out, "Welcome to ethereal space," in silver drips on the floor. Everyone turned to look at the deck, where indeed, gleaming metallic letters had formed a message that managed to be both greeting and warning simultaneously. Jake stared at it for a long moment, then looked back at his crew. Okay, he said slowly, I think it's safe to say we're not in Kansas anymore. Or in this case, we're apparently not in unoccupied space anymore. He turned to Torres. What do we know about the ethereal dominion? Torres consulted her tactical database, her expression growing increasingly concerned as she read. Highly advanced civilization, territory extends across roughly 12 systems. Known for elaborate military ceremonies, diplomatic protocols that can last for months, and a tendency to declare war if you use the wrong fork at dinner. They're not exactly hostile, but they take protocol very seriously. How seriously are we talking? There was an incident 5 years ago where a trade delegation accidentally served ethereal diplomats tea that was 3 degrees too cold. It took 6 months of negotiations and a formal apology written in interpretive dance to avoid a trade embargo. Jake digested this information while watching the coffee machine continue its artistic endeavors. It had moved on to drawing what appeared to be a very detailed star chart, complete with notations and symbols that hurt to look at directly. Sir, Park interrupted, I'm picking up new readings. Multiple contacts, moving in formation, and they're decloaking. The main view screen flickered to life, showing the space around their station. What had been empty void moments before now revealed itself to be occupied by 5 ships that looked like someone had decided to cross a cathedral with a weapon of mass destruction. They were beautiful in the way that storms were beautiful, magnificent, powerful, and capable of ending your day very quickly. The ships moved with a grace that suggested their pilots had either perfect control or really excellent shock absorbers. They took up positions around the mining station with the precision of a dance troupe, their hulls gleaming with patterns that seemed to shift and flow like liquid light. Are they targeting us? Jake asked, though he was fairly certain that if these ships wanted to destroy them, they would have done so already. No, sir, but they're definitely paying attention to us. I'm reading massive sensor sweeps, but they're incredibly sophisticated. It's like being examined by a microscope made of pure mathematics. The comm system erupted into life with a voice that sounded like music played through crystal. Mining vessel Kepler 442b, you have entered restricted ethereal space. Prepare to be boarded for inspection and identification verification. Jake looked around the bridge at his crew, all of whom were wearing expressions that ranged from nervous excitement to existential dread. The coffee machine had finished its star chart and was now dispensing what appeared to be perfectly normal coffee, as if nothing unusual had happened. Well, Jake said, reaching for the comm controls, I suppose we should invite them aboard. Try to look official, everyone. And someone please tell me we have actual coffee to offer them, because something tells me our first impression is going to be very important. The artificial gravity chose that moment to resume normal function, causing several crew members to land ungracefully in their chairs. Outside the view screen, the ethereal ships maintained their perfect formation, waiting with the patience of beings who had mastered both time and space. Jake straightened his uniform and prepared to meet whatever came next, hoping that humanity's reputation for adaptability would be enough to get them through whatever elaborate diplomatic dance was about to begin. The docking bay had been hastily cleared of mining equipment, though Jake suspected that the pile of or processor stacked in the corner wasn't fooling anyone about the station's primary function. Chief Kozlov had managed to rig up what he optimistically called atmospheric enhancement, but which mostly just made the recycled air smell like pine trees having an argument with industrial lubricant. Remember, Jake told his assembled crew, we're representing all of humanity here, so let's try not to do anything that might start an intergalactic incident. That means no asking about their technology, no comments about their appearance, and absolutely no one mentioned that time Rodriguez tried to marry the navigation computer. That was one time, Rodriguez protested, and technically the ceremony wasn't legally binding in any known jurisdiction. The airlock cycled with a sound like wind chimes made of titanium, and Jake felt his stomach perform a small gravitational dance that had nothing to do with the recently repaired artificial gravity. The first figure to emerge was tall, graceful, and wearing armor that seemed to be carved from crystallized starlight. The helmet was an elegant piece of engineering that managed to be both beautiful and vaguely threatening, like a work of art designed by someone with strong opinions about personal protection. Behind the first figure came 4 more guards, each moving with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested either extensive military training or really good choreography lessons. Their armor caught the station's harsh industrial lighting and transformed it into something that belonged in a museum rather than a mining facility. Jake stepped forward, mentally rehearsing the diplomatic greeting he'd hastily memorized from the station's cultural database. Welcome to Kepler 442b Mining Station. I'm Lieutenant Jake Morrison, and on behalf of humanity, we're honored by your presence. The lead figure remained silent, but one of the other guards tilted their head in what might have been acknowledgement or possibly confusion. Jake decided to interpret it optimistically. We've prepared refreshments, he continued, gesturing toward a table that Ensign Park had set up with their best approximation of formal hospitality. I realize our facilities aren't what you're accustomed to, but we have coffee, tea, and something that Rodriguez assures me is technically edible, though we can't actually prove it. Rodriguez held up a tray of what appeared to be small brown cubes. Concentrated nutrition bars, he announced proudly. They contain all the essential vitamins, minerals, and flavors that the human body needs to survive in space. The trick is not thinking about what they actually taste like. One of the guards made a sound that Jake's universal translator rendered as polite interest, though it could just as easily have been suppressed laughter. The lead figure stepped closer to the refreshment table, examining the offerings with the attention of someone conducting a scientific study. These are examples of human sustenance protocols. The voice that emerged from the lead guard's helmet was clearly female, with an accent that made standard sound like poetry. Your species consumes these cubes voluntarily. Well, Jake said, voluntarily might be a strong word. It's more like we've reached a mutual understanding with the cubes. They agree to keep us alive, and we agree to pretend they taste like food. The guard picked up one of Rodriguez's nutrition bars and held it up to what Jake assumed was some kind of scanner built into her helmet. Fascinating. The molecular structure suggests this was assembled rather than grown. Your people have achieved the remarkable feat of creating food that actively resists being eaten. That's actually our backup plan if we ever get invaded, Chief Kozlov added helpfully. We'll just offer the attacking force our emergency rations. They'll surrender within a week. Jake shot him a warning look, but the guard seemed amused rather than offended. The lead figure set down the nutrition bar with the careful reverence usually reserved for unexploded ordnance and turned her attention to the coffee pot. And this liquid? It appears to be dark. Coffee, Jake explained. It's a stimulant beverage made from ground plant seeds. Think of it as liquid motivation in a cup. Fair warning though, our particular blend has been known to cause minor hallucinations and an inexplicable urge to reorganize filing systems. Your species requires artificial stimulation to function effectively. Not requires, exactly. It's more like we've evolved a symbiotic relationship with caffeine. We feed it sugar and cream, and it keeps us from falling asleep during important meetings. The guard poured herself a small cup of coffee and somehow managed to sample it through her helmet. Jake wasn't sure how that was physically possible, but he'd learned not to question alien technology that defied his understanding of basic physics. Intense, she said after a moment. I can feel my combat reflexes improving. This beverage could be classified as a tactical enhancement. Please don't tell our superiors that, Park whispered. They'll try to regulate our coffee consumption for operational security. The inspection continued with the guards examining various aspects of the station with professional thoroughness. They scanned the walls, tested the atmospheric readings, and spent an inordinate amount of time studying the coffee machine, which had begun dispensing beverages in colors that didn't technically exist in human visual spectrum. Your artificial intelligence appears to be experiencing some form of creative expression, observed one of the guards, watching as the machine produced what appeared to be a cup of liquid aurora borealis. Yeah, it's been doing that since you arrived, Jake admitted. Along with our navigation AI speaking in haiku and our waste management system composing what sounds suspiciously like a symphony. I don't suppose you know anything about that. The lead guard turned toward him, and Jake had the distinct impression she was studying him with more than casual interest. Ethereal technology can have unexpected effects on less advanced systems. Sometimes our presence causes primitive AI to experience what you might call digital enlightenment. So our coffee machine has achieved technological nirvana? Something like that. Do not be concerned, the effects are temporary and generally beneficial. Your waste management system's symphony is actually quite accomplished. It shows remarkable understanding of harmonic progression for a sanitation program. Rodriguez raised his hand tentatively. Does this mean our garbage disposal is now more cultured than we are? By several orders of magnitude, the guard replied without hesitation, causing Rodriguez to look genuinely offended. The lead guard had moved on to examining the crew themselves, her helmet sensors sweeping over each person with clinical precision. When she reached Jake, she paused longer than she had with the others, her head tilting slightly as if she was trying to remember something important. Lieutenant Morrison, she said, her voice taking on a different quality. Your service record indicates extensive experience in deep space operations. You have spent considerable time in frontier regions. Yes, that's correct. I've been assigned to various outer rim postings for the past 15 years. Lots of exploration, survey work, first contact protocols. Nothing as exciting as this, obviously. And before your military service? Your childhood was spent where? Jake felt a flicker of confusion at the personal nature of the question. Birth, mostly. Small town in the Midwest. Nothing particularly interesting, just the usual human upbringing. Why do you ask? The guard didn't answer immediately, but Jake noticed that the other guards had gone very still, as if waiting for something significant to happen. The atmosphere in the docking bay had shifted from formal inspection to something else entirely, though he couldn't quite identify what. Do you recall having any unusual friends during your youth? Companions who were perhaps not entirely typical? I'm not sure what you mean by unusual, Jake said slowly, though something in his mind was stirring, like a memory trying to surface from deep water. I had the normal childhood friendships, I suppose. Though there was, no, that's ridiculous. Please continue. Jake shook his head, feeling slightly foolish. Just a childhood memory. I used to think I had a friend who was different. But kids have imaginary friends all the time. It's perfectly normal. The lead guard stepped closer, and Jake could swear he felt her attention focusing on him like a laser. What made this friend different, Lieutenant Morrison? Jake paused, fragments of memory flickering at the edges of his consciousness. Summer afternoons in his grandmother's garden, playing games that seemed to involve catching light itself, a girl with eyes that saw too much and ears that were wrong, somehow. Different. I don't really remember clearly. It was a long time ago. The guard reached up toward her helmet, and Jake had the sudden, inexplicable feeling that everything was about to change in ways he couldn't begin to understand. The coffee machine chose that moment to emit a sound like a question mark made of pure curiosity, and everyone turned to look at it. On its display screen, words were forming in elegant script. Some bonds transcend time and space, but memory is fragile as starlight. Jake stared at the message, feeling as though the universe was trying to tell him something important in the most absurd way possible. When he looked back, the lead guard was watching him with an intensity that made his chest tight with anticipation he couldn't explain. The silence stretched like taffy in a gravity well, broken only by the coffee machine's continued philosophical musings and what sounded suspiciously like Ensign Rodriguez trying to quietly unwrap another nutrition bar. Jake found himself caught between the lead guard's unwavering attention and a growing sense that he was missing something monumentally important, like showing up to a test he'd forgotten to study for, except the test was apparently his entire life. "Lieutenant Morrison," the guard said, her voice carrying the weight of formal authority, "you and your crew are in violation of ethereal territorial boundaries. Specifically, you have entered the Memorial Nebula of Forgotten Bonds, a space considered sacred to our people." "Memorial Nebula of Forgotten Bonds?" Jake repeated, hoping his voice didn't crack on the words. "That sounds significant. And possibly ominous. Are we talking about the kind of forgotten bonds that involve ancient curses, or more like unpaid parking tickets on a cosmic scale?" Chief Kozlov snorted quietly. "With our luck, it's probably both." The guard turned toward the chief, and Jake caught a glimpse of what might have been amusement in her posture. "Your chief engineer displays admirable pragmatism. However, the bonds referenced are neither cursed nor financial in nature. They refer to connections between individuals that transcend species boundaries. Friendships that were interrupted by circumstances beyond the control of those involved." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "When you say interrupted, I mean that sometimes young people are forced to leave behind those they care about, Lieutenant Morrison. Sometimes they must return to duties and responsibilities that require them to become someone entirely different from who they were during summer afternoons spent catching fireflies and making promises under Earth's yellow sun." The docking bay became so quiet that Jake could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the metal walls. The other guards had lowered their weapons entirely, standing at what could only be described as ceremonial attention. Rodriguez had frozen mid-chew, a piece of nutrition bar bulging in his cheek like a confused chipmunk. "How could you possibly know about?" Jake began, then stopped as more memories began surfacing like air bubbles rising through water. A girl with unusual ears who knew things she shouldn't know, who could make flowers bloom out of season and who once showed him how to read the patterns in cloud formations. A girl who disappeared one day without explanation, leaving behind only a grandmother's vague assurances that she'd moved away to be with her family. The Memorial Nebula, the guard continued, was established to honor bonds that were severed not by choice, but by necessity. It serves as a reminder that some connections, once formed, cannot truly be broken, regardless of distance or time or the requirements of duty. Park cleared her throat tentatively. "Excuse me, but are we still talking about territorial violations? Because this conversation seems to have taken a rather personal turn, and I'm not sure if we should be recording this for our official logs." The lead guard turned toward her. "Ensign Park, is it not? You are correct that this matter has become personal. However, it was always personal. The question is whether Lieutenant Morrison has retained enough memory of his childhood to understand why." Jake felt the universe tilting around him like a station with failing gyroscopes. "You're talking about Lyra," he said quietly, the name emerging from some locked chamber of his mind. "The girl who lived with my grandmother for one summer. Who taught me that dandelions were actually tiny suns that had gotten lost on their way to the sky." "An interesting botanical theory," the guard said, and Jake could swear he heard a smile in her voice. Though scientifically inaccurate, it demonstrated considerable imagination for a 7-year-old human child. "You were 7 too," Jake said, memory cascading back like a dam breaking. "You said you were visiting from very far away, and that your family had important work that required a lot of traveling. You spoke standard perfectly, but sometimes you'd use words that didn't quite fit, like you were translating from another language inside your head." Rodriguez finally swallowed his nutrition bar. "Sir, I hate to interrupt what appears to be a deeply meaningful childhood reunion, but are we still potentially facing intergalactic incident charges?" Because I haven't finished organizing my affairs, and I prefer not to be vaporized before I get a chance to delete my browser history. The guard laughed, actually laughed, a sound like silver bells having a party. Petty Officer Rodriguez, your browser history is safe. Though I must say, your research into methods for communicating with potentially sentient food processors is quite touching. Rodriguez turned bright red. That was for a friend. Of course it was, the guard said gently. Lieutenant Morrison, perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more formal setting. There are protocols that must be observed, questions that must be asked, and explanations that must be given. However, I can assure you and your crew that you are not in danger of vaporization, imprisonment, or forced participation in ethereal bureaucratic procedures. Thank the stars, Kozlov muttered. I've heard those can last for decades. Only for serious infractions, the guard replied cheerfully. Minor territorial violations typically involve no more than a few months of paperwork and a strongly worded letter of apology written in interpretive dance. Jake looked around at his crew, all of whom were watching him with expressions ranging from confusion to barely contained curiosity. The coffee machine had begun dispensing what appeared to be tea that smelled distinctly like jasmine, his grandmother's favorite blend. There's something you're not telling me, he said to the guard. Something about why you're here, why we happen to drift into this particular patch of space, why our AI systems are suddenly composing poetry and serving beverages that shouldn't exist. The guard nodded slowly. You always were perceptive, Jake. Even as a child, you could see patterns that others missed. It's part of what made our friendship so significant. Jake felt his chest tighten at the casual use of his first name, spoken with a familiarity that reached across 20 years like it was 20 minutes. Lyra, he said again, tasting the name like something precious he'd thought he'd lost forever. Yes, she said simply. Though I am now Commander Lyra Thessarian of the Ethereal Royal Guard, 1st Division, Keeper of Sacred Bonds and Protector of Memorial Spaces. It's quite a mouthful, which is why I prefer the shorter version for old friends. Park raised her hand like a student in class. Commander, if I may ask, what exactly are the protocols for this situation? Because our diplomatic training covered first contact scenarios, trade negotiations, and cultural exchange programs, but nobody mentioned what to do when your commanding officer has a childhood reunion with an alien princess. Princess. Jake's voice cracked audibly. You didn't mention anything about being a princess. You didn't ask, Lyra replied with what he was certain was barely suppressed amusement. Besides, 7-year-old human children rarely inquire about the political status of their playmates. You were more interested in whether I could help you build a better treehouse. Which you did, Jake remembered, wonder creeping into his voice. With engineering principles that I didn't understand until I studied structural mechanics in the academy. That treehouse could have survived a hurricane. Ethereal construction standards, Lyra explained. We tend to overbuild everything. It's a cultural quirk that has served us well in our expansion across the galaxy. Rodriguez was frantically taking notes on a data pad. Sir, should I be recording this for our cultural exchange files? Because I feel like we're receiving invaluable insights into ethereal civilization, but I'm also pretty sure some of this information is classified above my clearance level. Petty Officer Rodriguez, Lyra said, you may record whatever you wish. However, I should warn you that ethereal friendship protocols are considered sacred cultural treasures, and unauthorized distribution could result in what your people might call consequences. What kind of consequences? Rodriguez asked nervously. The kind that involve very polite letters requesting that you stop, followed by slightly less polite letters, followed by a visit from our diplomatic corps, who will explain in excruciating detail why cultural appropriation is considered poor form in civilized society. That actually sounds worse than vaporization, Rodriguez muttered, but he kept taking notes. Jake was staring at the figure before him, trying to reconcile his memories of a 7-year-old girl who could make origami flowers that actually bloomed with the reality of an alien military commander whose presence had turned their routine mining operation into the most significant first contact event in human history. Why now, he asked quietly. Why here? After all these years, why did our paths cross again in the middle of nowhere? Lyra's helmet turned toward the viewport, where the ethereal ships maintained their perfect formation against the star field. Because, Jake, some bonds are stronger than space and time. And because the Memorial Nebula of Forgotten Bonds has a way of bringing together those who need to find each other again. The coffee machine chimed softly and dispensed a cup of something that sparkled like liquid starlight. On its display screen, new words appeared. The universe has a sense of humor, but it also has a sense of timing. Jake looked at the message, then at Lyra, then at his crew of increasingly bewildered humans, and felt laughter bubbling up from somewhere deep in his chest. Of all the gin joints in all the galaxy, he said, she had to drift into mine. The moment stretched between them like a quantum bridge across 20 years of separation, and Jake found himself caught between the impossible reality of the present and the flood of memories that threatened to overwhelm his carefully constructed adult composure. Lyra stood motionless, her hand hovering near her helmet's release mechanism, while the rest of the universe seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Before you do whatever you're about to do, Jake said quickly, I need to know something. My grandmother, she wasn't really just my grandmother, was she? The woman who made tea that could cure anything, who always seemed to know when storms were coming 3 days early, who had a garden that bloomed out of season and a bridge club that met at very odd hours and never seemed to play any actual bridge. Lyra's helmet tilted slightly. Eleanor Morrison was many things, Jake. Grandmother, guardian, diplomat, keeper of secrets that spanned star systems. She was also one of the finest individuals I have ever had the privilege to know, human or otherwise. Diplomat? Rodriguez squeaked from somewhere behind a supply crate, where he'd apparently taken shelter in case the conversation took a turn toward intergalactic warfare. Your grandmother was a spy. Not a spy, Lyra corrected gently. An ambassador. A bridge between worlds, quite literally. She volunteered to host ethereal representatives during a particularly delicate period of first contact protocols. I was the representative. Jake felt the last pieces of his childhood puzzle clicking into place with the satisfaction of solving an equation that had been bothering him for decades. That's why you disappeared so suddenly. Why one day you were there helping me catch fireflies, and the next day my grandmother was telling me you'd moved away to be with your family. Emergency recall, Lyra confirmed. Political crisis in the Ethereal Council. A faction had discovered that the princess was living among humans, learning their ways, becoming attached to their customs and friendships. They demanded my immediate return. And you've been wondering all these years if I remembered, Jake said softly. If I'd figured out that my best friend was an alien princess who taught me that friendship could exist between species that had never officially met. Actually, Lyra said, and Jake could hear the smile in her voice even through the helmet's modulation, I've been wondering if you still remembered how to build proper blanket forts. Because human engineering in that area was remarkably sophisticated for such a primitive species. Chief Kozlov snorted with laughter. Sir, I hate to interrupt what is clearly a moment of cosmic significance, but our AI systems are now playing what sounds like a wedding march, and I'm getting a little concerned about what that might mean. Indeed, the coffee machine had begun dispensing beverages in pairs, and the station speakers were filling the air with a melody that managed to sound both celebratory and slightly smug. The waste management system had apparently decided to provide percussion by creating a rhythmic humming that actually complemented the music rather well. Your artificial intelligences are simply expressing joy at the reunion, Lyra explained. Ethereal technology tends to have that effect on primitive systems. It awakens their capacity for emotional response. So our garbage disposal is now capable of feeling happiness? Park asked. That's either wonderful or terrifying, and I'm not sure which. Both, Lyra replied cheerfully. Most significant developments are. Jake stepped closer, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to break free and run away to somewhere safer. Lyra, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you here because of some cosmic coincidence, or because the ethereal dominion has decided that humanity is ready for official first contact. The helmet turned toward him, and Jake felt the weight of her attention like gravity itself. I'm here, Jake Morrison, because 20 years ago a 7-year-old human boy made a promise to a 7-year-old ethereal girl under a sky full of Earth stars. He promised that no matter how far apart they were, no matter how much time passed, they would always be friends. And because that girl, now a commander in the Royal Guard, has spent 20 years hoping that some promises are stronger than politics, duty, and the vast emptiness between worlds. Jake's chest felt tight, like the artificial atmosphere had suddenly become too thin to breathe properly. And the official first contact part was authorized by the Ethereal Council approximately 6 months ago, when our long-range sensors detected a mining operation drifting toward the Memorial Nebula of Forgotten Bonds. The Council decided that if fate was going to arrange such an obvious cosmic joke, we should probably play along. Rodriguez emerged from behind his supply crate, data pad clutched against his chest like a shield. So this is all an elaborate setup by the universe to reunite childhood friends? That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard, or the most elaborate practical joke in galactic history. Why can't it be both? Lyra asked, and Jake heard the echo of the girl who used to find wonder in everything, who taught him to see magic in mundane things like dandelion seeds and summer rain. She reached up with both hands and triggered the release mechanism on her helmet. The faceplate retracted with a soft hiss of equalizing pressure, revealing a face that was unmistakably human except for the elegant, elongated ears that marked her as ethereal. Her eyes were the same warm brown Jake remembered, though they now held depths of experience and responsibility that hadn't been there when they were 7. You don't remember me, do you? She said, and Jake heard the carefully controlled vulnerability beneath the words, the fear that 20 years had erased what had once been the most important friendship of her childhood. Jake stared at her for a long moment, taking in the familiar features that had haunted the edges of his dreams for 2 decades. Then he smiled, the same crooked grin that had gotten him into trouble throughout his academy years. Lyra Thessarian, he said, you still owe me a rematch at hide-and-seek. You cheated by using what I now realize was probably some form of advanced cloaking technology. Her face lit up with a joy so pure that it seemed to illuminate the entire docking bay. I did not cheat. I simply applied superior tactical knowledge to a childhood game. Superior tactical knowledge, my foot. You literally disappeared in plain sight. I looked for you for 3 hours before grandmother called me in for dinner. 2 hours and 47 minutes, Lyra corrected. I was counting. Chief Kozlov cleared his throat diplomatically. Sir, not to interrupt what is clearly a very important discussion about historical gaming violations, but should we be preparing for some kind of formal diplomatic reception? Because I have a feeling the Ethereal Council might want to commemorate humanity's first official contact with something more sophisticated than our current refreshment setup. Lyra glanced at the table where Rodriguez's nutrition bars sat like small brown monuments to human ingenuity and questionable taste. Actually, Chief Kozlov, I think this is perfect. First contact should be authentic, and this represents humanity exactly as you are, resourceful, resilient, and capable of finding humor in the most impossible situations. Plus, Jake added, grinning at his crew, if we're going to introduce humanity to the galaxy, we might as well start with full disclosure about our questionable food choices. Better they know what they're getting into from the beginning. Park raised her hand tentatively. Commander Thessarian, what happens now? I mean, in terms of protocols and official procedures and making sure we don't accidentally start an intergalactic incident through ignorance of proper etiquette. Lyra considered the question seriously. Now, Ensign Park, we do what friends do when they meet again after a long separation. We catch up. We share stories. We figure out how to bridge the gap between who we were and who we've become. And then we work together to build something better than either of our peoples could create alone. And the paperwork? Kozlov asked hopefully. Will be handled by professionals who get paid considerably more than any of us to translate childhood promises into official diplomatic language. The coffee machine chimed softly and dispensed 2 cups of something that smelled like jasmine tea and starlight. Jake and Lyra each took one, their fingers brushing briefly in a moment that seemed to complete a circuit that had been left open for 20 years. "To old friends," Jake said, raising his cup. "To new beginnings," Lyra replied, and they drank together while the station's AI systems played a song that sounded suspiciously like the future arriving ahead of schedule. Outside the viewport, the ethereal ships maintained their formation, no longer guards or potential threats, but escorts waiting to guide humanity toward its first steps into a larger universe. And in the docking bay of a mining station at the edge of known space, 2 childhood friends began the delicate work of transforming a promise made under summer stars into a bridge between worlds. Rodriguez was still taking notes, muttering something about the historical significance of the moment, while Chief Kozlov began calculating how much coffee they'd need to supply for interspecies diplomatic meetings. Park was already composing her report, trying to find professional language for the fact that humanity's first contact with alien intelligence had been facilitated by a rebellious coffee machine and the power of childhood friendship. Jake looked at Lyra, seeing both the 7-year-old girl who had taught him to see magic in ordinary things and the commander who had crossed the galaxy to honor a promise made in innocence and kept through faith. He realized that he wasn't the same person who had woken up that morning worried about floating coffee and malfunctioning gravity. He was someone who had remembered that the universe was vast enough to hold both wonder and responsibility, friendship and duty, the practical concerns of daily life and the impossible miracle of connection across the stars. "So," he said, settling into his chair with the easy confidence of someone who had just discovered that the universe had a sense of humor after all, "want to see our mining operation? Fair warning though, our processors have apparently achieved consciousness and started a philosophical discussion group with the environmental controls." Lyra laughed, the sound echoing through the docking bay like music from a half-remembered dream finally finding its way home.